A single island, adrift in the world's most violent latitudes. A fortress of black rock and gnarled, wind-scoured trees, permanently besieged by the furious gales of the roaring Forties. This is Auckland Island, a place so remote, so fundamentally hostile, it seems designed by nature itself to reject human life. The air is thick with a constant chilling mist, and the silence is broken only by the shriek of the wind and the percussive crash of colossal waves against its iron shores. In the bleak winter of 1864, this unforgiving landscape became an unwitting laboratory for the human soul. Unbeknownst to the world, and, most cruelly, unbeknownst to each other, two ships met their end upon its shores at nearly the same time. On the eastern coast, exposed to the full, untamed fury of the Southern Ocean, the clipper ship Invercold was blinded by a storm and driven directly onto the cliffs. The sound was not of splintering wood, but of a world being torn apart. In a matter of minutes, the vessel was reduced to kindling, and 19 men were thrown into the churning, freezing surf. Those who survived the initial impact crawled ashore onto a landscape of sheer rock faces and impenetrable thorny scrub. They had nothing, not a tool, not a biscuit, not a dry thread of clothing. They had only the terror in their hearts and the vast, indifferent ocean at their backs. On the opposite side of the island, separated by a spine of impassable, razor-sharp mountains, the schooner Grafton met a quieter but no less final fate. Trapped in a storm, her captain, Thomas Musgrave, skillfully navigated her into a deep, protected harbor, hoping to ride it out. But the anchor chain snapped and the ship was relentlessly pushed aground. The five-man crew stepped off their wounded vessel not onto a beach of despair, but into a pocket of relative calm. They managed to salvage tools, barrels of salted meat, sails, and even the ship's small library. They found themselves in a place of possibility within the larger storm. One island, two shipwrecks, two crews, marooned in the same prison but in entirely different cells, each believing they were the only souls alive at the edge of the world. The men of the Invercold, stripped of everything that defined their world, rank, tools, purpose, would soon find the veneer of society stripped away as well. Their story would become a descent into a nightmare of anarchy, starvation, and the ultimate human taboo. Paranoia would become their law, and the weak would become prey for the desperate. The men of the Grafton, facing the same gnawing hunger, the same soul-crushing isolation, would make a different choice. They would look at the wreckage not as a tomb, but as a resource. They would build a forge from stone and sealskin, smelt iron from the ship's fittings, and hammer out the very tools of their own salvation. They would establish a democracy, write laws to govern themselves, and hold each other to a standard of conduct, refusing to let the wilderness that surrounded them invade their minds. This is a story about more than just survival. It is a stark, real-world experiment about the invisible architecture of hope and the brutal, terrifying cost of its collapse. It forces us to ask a fundamental question. When everything is taken away, when the world ends and you are left with nothing but your own nature, what is it that truly keeps you human? If you are fascinated by these true stories of resistance, where the limits of the human spirit are tested in the most extreme environments, a simple like on this video helps us continue to bring these forgotten histories to light. For the 19 survivors of the Invercold, the island was not a place to be conquered. It was a sentence to be served. Their first days were a blur of shivering misery, a collective trauma that froze the will. Captain George Dalgarno, a man broken by the loss of his ship, became a ghost in his own tragedy, offering no leadership, no words of comfort, only a vacant stare into the gray, unforgiving sea. The chain of command, so absolute on the deck of a clipper, dissolved into the freezing mist. It was the first mate, Andrew Smith, who fought against the encroaching lethargy. He argued, pleaded for exploration, for a systematic search for food and shelter. But his words fell on deaf ears. Most of the men, hollowed out by shock and exposure, refused to move from the scant protection of an overhanging cliff. They huddled together, a miserable mass of humanity, surrendering to a lethargy of despair, waiting for a rescue that would never come looking for them here. The group fractured. Smith took a few able-bodied men and pushed inland, a desperate foray into the tangled, hostile vegetation. They found nothing. The roots were woody and bitter, the birds too swift. They returned empty-handed, their meager hope extinguished. The island's diet became a grim communion with the rocks, a rotation of limpets scraped from their beds, and the occasional piece of blubber from a washed-up seal, eaten raw because they had no means to make a fire. Sickness, the patient predator, began its work. Scurvy set in, a slow internal decay. Gums turned black and spongy, teeth loosened in their sockets, and old wounds reopened as if the body was unhealing itself. The social contract, that thin veneer of civilization, began to peel away. A man who found a larger piece of shellfish would devour it in secret, his back turned to the others, his eyes darting suspiciously at his starving comrades. The law of the ship was dead. The law of the belly was absolute. There was no sharing. There was only the gnawing void in the stomach and the growing certainty that another man's death meant a slightly greater chance for your own. Across the island's frozen spine, a different story was being written in timber and smoke. In the sheltered cove of Port Ross, Captain Musgrave and his 4 men were not waiting, they were working. Their first priority was a testament to their mindset, not just a shelter, but a home. They systematically dismantled what was left of the Grafton, salvaging every plank, nail, and bolt in a war against entropy. With the ship's axe and saw, they felled trees, squaring logs with painstaking effort. Over weeks of relentless labor, a sturdy cabin rose from the coastal scrub. They christened it Epic Weight, an indigenous name from the first mate's homeland, meaning a home by the water. It was their fortress against the psychological storm. Inside, they built bunks, a table, and a stone fireplace that became the heart of their new world. Musgrave understood that idle hands bred despair, and that survival was not just a physical battle, but a psychological one. He instituted a rigid routine, a scaffolding for their sanity. Days were for work, hunting the sea lions that populated the bay, smoking the meat for preservation, mending their tattered clothes with sailcloth and salvage needles. Evenings were for society. They read aloud from the few books they had saved, Shakespeare, nautical almanacs, a Bible. They debated, they told stories, they maintained the rituals of men who believed they still belonged to the world. Musgrave kept a meticulous journal, not just as a record, but as an act of defiance. He documented their rules, their rations, their small victories, cementing their society on paper. Their greatest triumph, however, was born from the black sand of the beach. They needed more tools, stronger tools, and so, with staggering ingenuity, they decided to build a forge. They constructed a hearth from flat stones, mortared with clay. For bellows, they fashioned a wooden frame and stretched seal hide across it, a crude but effective lung to breathe life into the fire. They built a charcoal pit to create fuel. Then they began to harvest the iron from the Grafton skeleton, heating the bolts and braces until they glowed a furious, malevolent red, and hammering them into new shapes on a flat stone anvil. The first time the bellows pushed a jet of air into the charcoal and the embers roared to a white heat was a moment of profound victory. With fire and iron, they were not just making nails and repairing their axe, they were reforging their own destiny. It was a declaration of war against the wilderness, proof that human intellect and cooperation could impose order on even the most savage corner of the earth. For the men of the Invercold, time itself began to rot. Days bled into one another in a monotonous cycle of hunger, cold, and a deepening, bone-aching lethargy that felt like a physical weight. The relentless wind was a constant torment, a voice that whispered of madness in their ears. The first to die was a young sailor, barely a man. He didn't perish in some dramatic struggle against the elements, but simply faded, his body consuming itself from the inside out. He lay down one afternoon, his eyes fixed on the gray, churning horizon, and never got up again. His death was met not with sorrow, but with a chilling, pragmatic silence. The survivors, gaunt figures with sunken eyes, looked at his emaciated form and then at each other. The unspoken question hung in the frigid air, a presence more real and more terrifying than any ghost. What do you do with the dead when the living are starving? The group's moral compass, already spinning wildly, shattered completely. Andrew Smith, the first mate, who had tried to impose order, argued for a burial, a final act of respect to preserve the last shred of their humanity. But his authority was gone, drowned in the sea of desperation. His death was met not with sorrow, but with a chilling, pragmatic silence. The survivors, gaunt figures with sunken eyes, looked at his emaciated form and then at each other. The unspoken question hung in the frigid air, a presence more real and more terrifying than any ghost. What do you do with the dead when the living are starving? The group's moral compass, already spinning wildly, shattered completely. Andrew Smith, the first mate, who had tried to impose order, argued for a burial, a final act of respect to preserve the last shred of their humanity. But his authority was gone, drowned in the sea of desperation. A handful of men, their minds warped by famine, saw not a fallen comrade, but a collection of calories, a reprieve from the gnawing agony in their bellies. The line was crossed in the dead of night. There was no ceremony, no discussion, just the grim, quiet work of butchery under a sliver of a moon. The act unleashed a new kind of horror. Paranoia became the air they breathed. Men would no longer sleep in the main group, but crawl away to their own miserable hollows in the rocks, guarding the few limpets they had gathered, convinced their crewmates were now sizing them up, waiting for them to weaken. They were a crew no more. They were a pack of starving, suspicious animals, trapped in a cage of rock and sea, haunted by the ghosts of the men they had been and the men they had consumed. On the other side of the island, in the small, fire-lit world of Epigwite, the crew of the Grafton faced their own psychological battles. The relentless winter storms battered their cabin, and the endless days of gray skies and shrieking winds wore on their nerves. Tensions would occasionally flare over small things, a misplaced tool, a burnt piece of meat. But where the Inverco's society had crumbled at the first touch of pressure, the Grafton's was built to withstand it. Captain Musgrave's rules, the democracy they had established, acted as a release valve. Disputes were settled by vote. Grievances were aired by the fire in the evenings, not allowed to fester into paranoid resentment. They fought the psychological decay with routine and purpose. They improved their home, building a chimney that drew the smoke out more efficiently. They experimented with tanning sealskins to make sturdier boots. The French cook, François Reynal, a man of remarkable ingenuity, even managed to distill a crude but drinkable spirit from fermented roots, a small luxury that briefly lifted their spirits and reminded them of a world they had left behind. Their greatest challenge was the creeping realization, as the months turned into a year, that no one was coming. The hope of a passing ship began to feel like a childish fantasy. It was in this crucible of fading hope that their most audacious idea was born. It began as a murmur, then a debate, and finally a concrete plan. They would not wait for rescue. They would build it. They would take the ruined keel of the Grafton, raise its sides with timber from the island's tough rata trees, and fashion a new vessel, a boat strong enough to challenge the most dangerous ocean on Earth. The forge, once a tool for making nails, would now be used to create the fittings for a ship. The axe, once used for firewood, would now shape the ribs of their ark. It was a task of almost insane ambition, a gamble against impossible odds. But it gave them something the Invercalled crew had lost entirely, a future they could build with their own hands. The sound of the hammer striking hot iron, ringing out across the desolate harbor, was not just the sound of work. It was the sound of defiance. It was the sound of 5 men refusing to become beasts, choosing instead to become builders in the face of the void. The work was a brutal symphony of human will against a backdrop of elemental chaos. For 4 agonizing months, the men toiled. Their world shrank to the rhythmic scrape of the saw, the percussive clang of the hammer, and the groan of strained muscles. They felled the tough, twisted rata trees with an axe that grew dull with every swing, its edge a testament to their relentless effort. They learned to split the logs, not with wedges they didn't have, but by laboriously sawing grooves and then pounding them apart with heavy wooden mallets, a process that could take an entire day for a single usable plank. Every piece of timber was a victory won through aching backs and hands raw with blisters. Francois Renault, the cook turned master shipwright, was the heart of the operation. He was a force of nature, a man possessed by a singular, defiant purpose. Using the bellows they had salvaged, he brought the forge to life each morning, its orange glow a beacon against the perpetual gray of the island. He took the rusted iron bolts from the Grafton's wreckage, heated them until they glowed with the color of the setting sun, and hammered them into new shapes on a crude stone anvil. He fashioned every nail, every bracket, every fitting they would need. In a stroke of pure genius, he even constructed a primitive lathe, allowing him to turn wood for more precise components. He was not just building a boat, he was forging their salvation from the scraps of their disaster. The island fought them every step of the way. Howling gales would rip through the harbor, threatening to tear their fragile framework apart. Freezing rain would soak them to the bone, turning their hands numb and their tools slippery. The sea, a constant menacing presence, seemed to mock their efforts, its roar a reminder of the power they intended to challenge. As the vessel took shape, a stark and terrible reality began to dawn on them. Their creation, which they christened the Forlorn Hope, was a marvel of ingenuity, but it was small, dangerously small. It was barely a boat, more of a glorified dinghy, its sides raised just enough to fend off the waves. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a ship, caulked with a foul-smelling mixture of seal blubber and ash. It was strong, but it could only carry 3 men and the barest of provisions. 5 was an impossibility. The weight would swamp it in the first significant swell. The social contract they had so carefully built was now facing its ultimate test. Who would go, and who would be left behind? The question hung in the smoky air of the cabin for days, unspoken but felt by every man. The camaraderie forged in survival was now poisoned by a silent, terrifying calculus. To stay was to risk a slow death from starvation or despair if the boat failed. To go was to face the near certainty of being swallowed by the roaring 40s, some of the most treacherous seas on the planet. They put it to a vote, the cornerstone of their society. The decision was agonizing, each man weighing his own life against the lives of his companions. Captain Musgrave, as the leader and navigator, had to go. Renault, the boat's builder, knew its every weakness and strength. He was essential. The third spot fell to the sailor, Alec McLaren, strong and experienced at sea. The other 2, George Harris and Henry Forges, would remain. It was a decision born of cold, hard logic, but it felt like an amputation. They were cutting off a part of their small family, gambling that 3 could save 5. On the 19th of July, 1865, after 19 months of exile, the moment arrived. The sky was a sheet of lead. They loaded the Forlorn Hope with a few sealskins of water and some cooked meat. The 5 men stood on the shore, the tiny boat bobbing in the frigid water. There were no grand speeches, just firm handshakes and the quiet, desperate hope in their eyes. Musgrave, Raynal, and McLaren climbed aboard. As they pushed off from the shore, the two men left behind stood motionless, watching them go. They watched as the small craft, a speck of human defiance, made its way out of the protected harbor. They watched it catch the wind and begin its perilous journey into the open, gray immensity of the Southern Ocean. They watched until it was swallowed by the horizon, until there was nothing left but the endless expanse of water and the shrieking of the wind. And then they were truly alone. The silence that descended was heavier than any storm. They turned and walked back to the cabin, Epigwait, their home. But it was no longer a shelter for 5. It was a tomb for 2. For the 3 men in the Forlorn Hope, the island was replaced by a new prison, one made of churning gray water and a sky that promised only violence. Their world was a space of less than 15 feet, constantly assaulted by the roaring 40s. Waves the size of liquid mountains rose up around them, their crests frothing with white rage. The tiny boat would climb the face of one, hang for a terrifying moment at the peak with a view of an endless, chaotic seascape, and then plunge sickeningly into the trough, the next wave already looming over them like a collapsing wall. They were perpetually soaked, the frigid water seeping through their sealskin clothes, chilling them to the marrow. There was no sleep, only brief, exhausted stupors, punctuated by the jolt of a rogue wave or the scream of the wind through their makeshift rigging. They bailed constantly, their arms burning with fatigue, fighting a losing battle against the ocean that sought to reclaim their small vessel. Musgrave, clinging to the tiller, navigated by instinct and the rare glimpse of a watery sun, his eyes raw from the salt spray. He was a statue of grim determination, his mind a frantic calculator of currents and wind, the lives of all 5 men resting on his every decision. After 5 days and 5 nights of this liquid hell, a shadow appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a phantom of their exhausted minds, it was land. On the 24th of July, they ran the Forlorn Hope ashore on Stewart Island, New Zealand, collapsing onto the beach, more dead than alive. They had sailed 250 miles in a boat built from scrap and desperation, a feat of seamanship that bordered on the miraculous. They were found by local fishermen who stared in disbelief at the gaunt, wild-eyed men and their monstrously crude vessel. The story they told seemed impossible, a fever dream from another century. But the truth of it was etched on their faces and in the raw determination that had carried them across the abyss. Captain Musgrave did not rest. He did not celebrate. The moment he regained his strength, he had one singular focus: returning for the men they had left behind. He secured passage to the port of Invercargill, where he chartered a ship, the Flying Scud, to return to the Auckland Islands. He would honor the pact they had made. Back on the island, the silence for Harris and Forges was a living entity. The days bled into one another in a gray monotony of survival. They kept a fire burning, a constant vigil, its smoke a thin prayer sent up to an empty sky. Every shadow on the water was a ship. Every gust of wind carried the sound of a sail. Their hope was a flickering candle flame, constantly threatened with being extinguished by the winds of despair. And then, one morning, 6 weeks after their companions had vanished into the gray, a new shape appeared on the horizon. It was not a trick of the light. It was a ship, and it was heading for their harbor. As the Flying Scud dropped anchor and a small boat was lowered, the 2 castaways stood on the shore, their ordeal finally over. All 5 members of the Grafton crew were alive. All 5 had survived. But the story of Auckland Island was not yet complete. While exploring, the crew of the Flying Scud made a discovery on the opposite side of the island. They found the tattered remains of another camp. They found a crudely built shelter, and inside, human bones, some of them bearing the unmistakable marks of butchery. They found the 3 surviving members of the Invercold crew, skeletal figures with haunted eyes, men who had been broken by the island and by each other. They had descended into a state of nature at its most brutal, a war of all against all, where the weak were consumed by the strong. The island had been a laboratory, a cruel experiment in human nature. It presented two groups of men with the exact same challenge, the same desolate landscape, the same crushing isolation. One group, lacking leadership and structure, turned on each other, and their society collapsed into cannibalism and death. The other, under the guidance of a captain who insisted on law, democracy, and shared purpose, built a forge, a home, and a boat. They did not just survive, they retained their humanity. The Grafton story is not merely a tale of endurance against the elements. It is a profound testament to the fact that our greatest strength is not the will of the individual, but the structure of the collective. It proves that civilization is not a place, but a choice. A difficult, deliberate choice to build something together, even when the world is falling apart. The past is full of warnings and lessons of value. It reminds us that in the face of the abyss, we can choose to be beasts, or we can choose to be brothers. Subscribe so you don't miss the next expedition to the unknown.